"If you're good enough, come catch me." This wasn't a line from a film. It was a message left beside a corpse at the entrance of Tihar Prison, New Delhi. One morning, officers opened the gates of one of India's most fortified prisons and found a black bag containing human remains placed directly in front of them. Beside it, a letter, a brazen, mocking challenge to the authority of the state. Welcome to the killer's record. Today, we take you back into the case of Chandrakant Jha, the man who made the Delhi police lose face. Because this man didn't just kill, he deliberately declared war on the entire justice system. From an ordinary vegetable vendor in a street market to a killer bold enough to leave bodies at the prison gate, what was he trying to prove, and why was he so certain that no one could catch him? This is the case that defied the state. It began with one body, but it shook the entire Delhi police force to its core. Chandrakant Jha was born and raised in a small village called Kosai in the state of Bihar. His family background wasn't one of poverty or hardship, not the kind you'd expect from a man who would become a criminal. His father, Chandrakant Jha, was a retired government officer in the irrigation department. His mother, Champavati, taught at the local primary school. By village standards, they were a stable, well-respected family. But the problem was Chandrakant himself. He never felt like he belonged. He struggled in school, clashed constantly with his parents, and ultimately dropped out after the 8th grade. While his siblings went on to build successful lives, he alone seemed to fall short at every turn. In a family of achievers, he was the black sheep, the one who couldn't get anything right. The weight of that slowly became unbearable. As a teenager, he turned his back on his hometown and left. He carried with him a deep sense of being unseen, unheard, and unwanted, not from strangers, but from his own blood. He didn't just want money, he wanted recognition, the kind he had never once received from the people who shared his name. Beneath his blank, impassive exterior, a quiet rage was already taking shape from the day he walked out of Kosai and never looked back. By 1986, he had made his way to Delhi, and the city hit him harder than he'd imagined. He started out as a street vendor at Azadpur Market, one of the largest wholesale fruit and vegetable markets in India. The place was a world unto itself. Big money traders on one end, day laborers willing to risk everything for a few rupees on the other. Chandrakant scraped by selling whatever turned a profit: fresh vegetables, woven cloth, cheap plastic goods. He had no fixed address. Many nights he slept on the roadside or in empty corners of the market, surrounded by the smell of garbage and the threats of local strongmen who controlled the turf. Being shaken down, bullied and pushed around by these men became routine. He learned to survive by staying quiet, but never backing down if cornered. That period of his life hardened something inside him. He came to see the world as a place with no room for weakness, where everyone around you was a rival waiting for the right moment to step on you. Then his family tried to pull him back by arranging a marriage. Chandrakant agreed, hoping that having a wife, a household of his own, might give him something to hold on to in this vast, indifferent city. Instead, it became another failure. His wife left after just 1 year, unable to live with his volatile temper, the sudden explosions of rage that came whenever he felt slighted or disrespected. The collapse of his marriage drove the old wound deeper. Once again, he was unwanted. Even the one person who was supposed to stay had chosen to walk away. He decided then that love and connection were illusions, that everyone who entered his life was either after something or waiting for the chance to betray him. Disappointment stacked upon disappointment curdled into something uglier than grief. He shut himself off. He began looking at the people around him with permanent suspicion.
The true turning point came in 1997, when Chandrakant ran into serious trouble with the police in the Adarsh Nagar area of Delhi. He was accused of 3 counts of theft, allegedly breaking into residential properties. He denied every charge, insisting the cases had been fabricated because he refused to pay bribes. He believed he had been deliberately targeted as leverage, a way to pressure him into paying up. The officer he held responsible for that pressure was Manish Agrawal, a deputy commissioner of police overseeing the Northwest District of Delhi at the time. The conflict had started, as it often did in places like Azadpur, with extortion. Local police routinely collected money from street vendors in exchange for being left alone. No raids, no harassment. Chandrakant saw this as exploitation, and he refused to play along. He believed he was earning an honest living and had no reason to pay for the right to exist. When he held his ground, the police turned up the heat. His stall was seized, costing him days of income. Then came the theft charges and an arrest that pulled him into a legal process that would drag on for years. But beyond the charges, there was the humiliation. He was beaten in front of people who knew him, slapped, shoved, cursed at in the open market where he had spent years trying to build a life. In front of a crowd, he was stripped of the one thing he'd always fought to protect, his dignity. He went from being a hard-working man trying to survive to being treated like a criminal before anyone had heard his side of the story. The anger he felt toward the police stopped being mere resentment. It became something that settled into his bones. Inside Tihar prison, that fury was fed daily. He was beaten by guards, most notably by Balbir Singh, a senior officer who ran his cell block. He was forced to strip in front of other inmates. He was struck with batons, kicked, punched, and at times deliberately starved. He was mocked and degraded again and again until the walls of that cell had absorbed more of his suffering than he could carry. But it didn't break him. It calcified him. The pain, physical, psychological, didn't produce surrender. It produced something far more dangerous. A hatred so deep and so settled that forgiveness was no longer part of his vocabulary. By the time Chandrakant Jha walked out of Tihar, he had already declared a private war, one he intended to wage against the entire justice system of India. After surviving the worst of what prison had put him through, for crimes he maintained he never committed, Chandrakant Jha walked free and returned to the life he'd been trying to build. He wasn't starting from nothing. Back in 1997, before the charges derailed everything, he had found someone. Her name was Mamata, a woman he poured himself into and who became the foundation of the family he had always wanted. Now he was determined to be the man that family deserved. He wanted no one saying his wife had married a criminal. In their modest home, he played the role of devoted father to 5 daughters, working every hustle available to him, selling vegetables, clothing, cheap plastic goods, whatever it took to keep them comfortable. Neighbors saw a hard-working man who adored his children. As far as anyone around him could tell, family was everything to Chandrakant Jha. At Azadpur Market, he built a different kind of reputation as the unofficial older brother to migrant workers who had come from his home state of Bihar with nothing but hope. Whenever he spotted a young man freshly arrived in Delhi, lost and without connections, Chandrakant would approach him warmly. He'd offer food, a place to sleep, and the promise of work. It cost the newcomers nothing. It appeared to cost him nothing either. But behind that generosity was a selection process. He deliberately chose men who were alone, no family in Delhi, no one who would notice if they disappeared, no one who would file a report. The trust he offered wasn't kindness, it was a net, and he let his targets walk into it on their own. At home, the warmth had limits. Mamata was not allowed to work outside the house, not under any circumstances. Her role was to raise the children and stay in. Chandrakant himself would disappear for days at a time, sometimes longer, telling her he was traveling to other states for business, buying stock, making deals. She never questioned it. He always came back with money. What she didn't know was that during those absences, he was living a second life entirely. He kept a separate rented room, a space no one connected to his family knew about, where he handled what he called his private affairs. He had built a wall between his two lives, so clean and so complete that even the woman sleeping beside him every night had no idea what her husband was doing in the dark. The rage toward the Delhi police had never left him. It had simply gone quiet. Every time he watched officers patrolling Azadpur Market, shaking down vendors, pocketing money in broad daylight, the old anger surfaced. He swallowed it, but he never forgot the taste of being arrested, beaten, and humiliated. He began fixating on a plan to settle the score, not through confrontation, but through something far more calculated. He wanted to prove that a man like him could make the entire Delhi police force look like fools. He watched the men he housed and fed. He waited. He looked for small infractions, a lie, a cigarette smoked in secret, a piece of meat eaten after he had forbidden it. These weren't deal breakers. They were triggers, pretexts, excuses to release something that had been building inside him for years. And this time, he intended to make noise. By 1998, the Adarsh neighborhood of Delhi, this was where the fracture began. The moment that transformed Chandrakant Jha from a street vendor into something he had always wanted to be, a man with power over others. By then, his trading business at Azadpur Market had grown enough that he had money to spare and a reason to extend a hand to people around him. One of those people was Mongol, known in the market by his nickname, Pandit. The two men had a history. Mongol ran his own crew at the market and had clashed with Chandrakant more than once. During one argument over money or territory, Chandrakant had caught Mongol's hand with a vegetable knife. Whether it was intentional or not, Mongol took it seriously enough to go to the police. Chandrakant was briefly detained. When he got out, he switched tactics entirely. He started playing the role of a reformed man, offering Mongol food, help finding work, the easy warmth of someone who seemed to have moved on. He never invited Mongol to his rented room directly. He knew that would raise suspicion. Instead, he worked his way in gradually, carrying Mongol's heavy loads, helping him sort out small financial problems, making himself useful, the kind of presence that becomes difficult to distrust. But Mongol didn't respond with gratitude. He became arrogant. He spread rumors about Chandrakant, picked fights, and treated the generosity extended to him as something he was owed. For a man who had carried the wounds of being underestimated and disrespected since childhood, Ingratitude was the one thing Chandrakant could not absorb. His contempt curdled slowly into a decision. A man like that, he concluded, didn't deserve to keep breathing. He waited for the right moment. One day at the market, he approached Mangal with a calm expression and a simple proposition. There was information about market management, the kind that would matter to someone in Mangal's position, but it wasn't the kind of conversation to have in the open. "Come by the room tonight," he said. Mangal hesitated, but the promise of leverage, of being ahead of everyone else, was too appealing to refuse. Chandrakant had read him correctly. Men who hunger for power will always walk through the right door if you put the right thing behind it. That night, in a narrow rented room in Delhi, the two men shared a meal. Chandrakant watched. He waited until Mangal's guard dropped. Then he moved, fast, from behind, looping a thick rope around Mangal's neck and pulling with everything he had. Mangal struggled. He tried to call out, but the pressure crushed the sound before it could form, and within moments, he went still. The body on the floor did not frighten Chandrakant. What he felt, instead, was something closer to clarity. He retrieved a large, well-sharpened meat cleaver and went to work. He understood that carrying a whole body out of the room was a risk he couldn't afford. He cut methodically, arms, legs, head separated from the torso, though not cleanly, since this was still new to him. He wrapped each piece in the same black plastic bags he used at his vegetable stall every day. Then, over the following hours, he loaded the bags onto his cycle rickshaw and scattered them across Delhi, in alleyways, in roadside bins, distributed wide enough to make identification difficult. When it was done, he cleaned the room until no trace remained. The next morning, he was back at his stall, selling vegetables as if nothing had happened. The mistake came when police, piecing together the scattered remains, managed to identify the victim as Mangal. Investigators traced the last known contact back to Chandrakant. He was arrested and charged with murder and spent the next several years in custody awaiting trial. He felt no remorse, only more contempt. Then, improbably, the system handed him a way out. India's justice process moved slowly, and the case against him had gaps. The key evidence collected wasn't airtight. The most critical witness vanished without explanation. And Mangal's head was never recovered, making formal identification of the complete remains impossible. In 2002, after 4 years in custody, the court acquitted him and set him free. For Chandrakant, walking out of that courtroom didn't feel like relief, it felt like confirmation. The law couldn't touch him. He was above the system, and now he had proof. He returned to ordinary life wearing that certainty like armor. He resumed his role as the dependable neighborhood figure, the good father, the generous elder brother to Bihar's migrants in the big city. But inside, nothing had changed. He watched the people around him with cold, calculating eyes, quietly assessing who would come next. He did think about Mangal, specifically about how imperfect the killing had been. The struggle, the muffled sounds, the risk of someone hearing. It wasn't clean enough. He began working on a solution. He designed a device, 2 short wooden handles connected by a strong chain modeled loosely on the principle of a nunchaku. In private, during whatever time he could steal away from daily life, he practiced with it. He found that looping the chain around a throat and twisting the handles to tighten it could collapse the airway so quickly and completely that the victim couldn't produce a sound at all. The device gave him confidence, and the prospect of using it again, of punishing the next person who deserved it, had stopped feeling like something dark. It had started feeling like something to look forward to.
About a year after his release, Chandrakant had settled back into his familiar role at Azadpur Market, the dependable older brother,
the man you came to when you needed help. Shekhar was one of those who came to him. They worked in the same circles, and Chandrakant had been particularly close with him, close enough to lend him money from his own savings. Shekhar had come asking for help, claiming he had an urgent family matter back home. Chandrakant gave him the money without hesitation. Then he found out the truth. Shekhar had spent the money on alcohol. Not only that, he had been going around fabricating stories to squeeze more cash out of other people in the market. For Chandrakant, being lied to wasn't a minor offense. It wasn't about the money, it was about trust, and what it meant to have that trust deliberately destroyed. If Shekhar was willing to look him in the eye and lie, then as far as Chandrakant was concerned, the man had forfeited his right to exist. In June 2003, he decided to handle it. He didn't confront Shekhar. He didn't raise his voice or make a scene. He acted as if nothing had happened and invited Shekhar over to his rented room for a drink. Shekhar showed up. They sat together and drank. Chandrakant waited. He let Shekhar drink until his guard dissolved, until the alcohol had done its job. Then he moved, binding Shekhar's hands tight with rope before he could react. "This," he said, "is what happens to liars." Then he reached for the nunchaku he had built himself. He looped the chain around Shekhar's throat and twisted both handles inward, tightening the links until there was no give left. Shekhar fought back. His body resisted, instinctively, desperately, but he couldn't match Chandrakant's grip, and eventually, he stopped. What followed was the same ritual as before. Chandrakant picked up the meat cleaver and dismembered the body in that same room, methodically, with a steadiness that no longer required effort. He packed the remains into bags and drove them out to the deep drainage channels of the Mukmel-Milpur area, waterways thick with sewage and filth, and disposed of them there. He calculated that the current would carry the pieces away, and whatever remained would decompose in the dark. He was already thinking about the next time, about how to refine it further. The following morning, he was back at his stall, same spot, same routine, same easy conversation with the other vendors. When people began to notice that Shekhar hadn't shown up and came asking, Chandrakant gave a small shrug. He mentioned he was tired of the work here, probably went back to Bihar. Nobody pressed further. In a community built almost entirely of migrant workers, people disappeared all the time, moved on, went home, found work elsewhere. There was no reason to look twice. What satisfied Chandrakant most wasn't the act itself, it was the silence that followed. No investigation, no inquiry, not a single officer came asking questions about Shekhar's disappearance. The absence of any response from the police told him exactly what he needed to know. His method was sound, and the system had no interest in men like Shekhar. As long as he chose his victims carefully, men that society wouldn't miss, no one was going to come looking. And that certainty was becoming the most dangerous thing about him.
By late 2003, the noise around the previous disappearance had faded. Chandrakant began looking again. He found Umesh at Azadpur Market, a young migrant worker, newly arrived in the capital with nothing lined up. Chandrakant played the same role he always played, the generous older brother, the man who could get you sorted. He found Umesh work as a porter at the market and let him sleep in his rented room to cut costs. He looked after the young man like family. But that generosity had an expiration date. Over time, Chandrakant noticed small things, money going missing from what he earned selling vegetables, household items used without asking, without a word. To most people, these would have been minor irritations, the friction of shared living. To Chandrakant, they were something else entirely. He branded Umesh a traitor.
Loyalty was the only thing he ever demanded from the people around him. In the moment it was broken, his verdict was immediate. Umesh had no right to keep living. He chose his moment carefully. He cooked a meal, a proper one, generous enough to feel like a gesture of peace, and sat down with Umesh as if nothing was wrong. He waited until the young man had eaten, until his body was full and his guard was down. Then he came from behind, pinning Umesh's arms and binding his hands and feet with rope until he couldn't move. Umesh begged. Terrified, confused, he pleaded for his life. Chandrakant reached for the nunchaku. He looped the chain around Umesh's throat and pulled the handles tight. "This," he said, "is the price of betrayal." He didn't make it quick. He watched. He let the struggle run its course, the last desperate resistance of a body refusing to give up until it was over. In his mind, this wasn't murder. It was judgment. He was sending someone worthless to where they belonged. When the body had gone cold, he carried it to the bathroom and went to work with a sharpened blade, methodically, carefully, working to keep the blood contained. He packed the remains into multiple layers of heavy black plastic bags, sealed tightly. Then he loaded them onto his cycle rickshaw and moved through the pre-dawn streets of Delhi while the city was still asleep. His destination this time was deliberate: Gate number 1 of Tihar prison, the place where they had locked him up, where guards had beaten him and stripped him of whatever dignity he had left. He left the bag at the entrance, like a delivery, a gift for the officers and wardens to find when they arrived for the morning shift. Alongside it, written in his own hand, was a letter. It was addressed to Dadaji and Jijaji, Hindi terms meaning roughly grandfather and brother-in-law, but the tone made clear it was no family note. What caught the attention of the officers who read it was a particular detail: the signature. He had written Chandra Twin, referencing the moon twice, Chandra meaning moon in Sanskrit. He had signed his own name into the evidence without seeming to realize it. And by comparing himself to a second moon, a celestial body that answers to no one, he revealed something of his state of mind more clearly than any confession could.
He wasn't just killing and disappearing. He needed them to know who he was. He saw himself as elevated above ordinary men, above the law, above the police, above the system entirely. The letter wasn't a mistake, it was an announcement, the first formal declaration of a private war against every institution that had ever humiliated him. On the morning of November 20, 2003, officers from Harinagar police station discovered a jute sack at gate number 1 of Tihar prison. Inside, a human head, arms and legs, dismembered with grim precision. A murder case was registered immediately. Investigators moved to Azadpur market, questioned workers, and were able to identify the victim as Umesh, a young laborer from Bihar who had been missing for just a few days, last seen in the company of Chandrakant Jha. But that was as far as the investigation got. The dismemberment had destroyed most of the forensic evidence. DNA technology in Delhi in 2003 was limited. Witnesses who knew something said nothing. No one wanted to be the person who pointed a finger. The case stalled. No arrests were made. The press covered it briefly. The Times of India and Hindustan Times ran short items: dismembered body found at Tihar Gate. And within a day or two, the story was gone. The victim was a poor migrant worker with no family in Delhi, no one to demand answers, no one to keep the pressure on. In a city where laborers vanished routinely, an anonymous body at the prison gate became the kind of news people read and forgot. Nobody saw a pattern. Nobody connected Umesh to Shekhar, who had disappeared 5 months earlier. Chandrakant went back to his vegetable stall, but not before slipping away from the market to watch. He stood among the crowd that had gathered outside Tihar, just another curious face behind the police cordon, watching officers move frantically around the scene. He watched them scramble and felt only contempt at how far behind they already were, at how little they understood about what they were dealing with. The feeling of being untouchable, of holding power over life itself without consequence, didn't satisfy him. It made him want to go further.
2 years had passed since Umesh. Chandrakant had spent them in perfect normalcy, selling vegetables, going home to his wife and daughters, living the life of a man with nothing to hide. The silence around his previous killings only confirmed what he already believed. He had never made a mistake. Then, Gudu walked into his orbit. Chandrakant had given the young worker opportunities, found him work, extended the same generosity he offered everyone he chose to bring close. What he got back was a young man who took everything and invested it in getting high, spending whatever he earned on cannabis, drifting through his days in a fog, unmoved by any of it. Chandrakant, who saw himself as disciplined and forward-thinking, began pulling Gudu aside and warning him, "Quit the drugs, save your money, build something." The words landed nowhere. The more Gudu ignored him, the more Chandrakant's frustration curdled into something colder. He stopped seeing a wayward young man and started seeing dead weight, a drain on society that served no purpose. In his mind, the role he was preparing to play had already shifted from concerned mentor to executioner. Gudu wasn't someone to be saved anymore. He was something to be removed. On the night Chandrakant's patience ran out, Gudu was already half gone, slumped and barely conscious, too stoned to register what was happening around him. Chandrakant moved in from behind, and the ritual began again. Same room, same steps, same hands. "This," he said, "is what happens to useless, drug-wasting men." The intoxication had stripped Gudu of whatever resistance he might have had, and his body went still faster than any of the others. When it was over, Chandrakant sat down beside the body, ate a meal, and took a photograph, a private trophy. Then he went to work. He spent most of that night dismembering Gudu's body with the same unhurried precision he had refined across every previous killing, careful to keep the blood contained, cleaning each surface as he went until the room looked exactly as it had before any of it happened. By the time he was done, there was nothing left in that space that suggested a man had just died in it. This time, he changed where he disposed of the remains. No Tihar gate, no letter. He had been deliberate about that, varying his method to avoid giving investigators anything to connect. He chose Mangalpuri instead, a dense, run-down neighborhood on the city's margins where crime was common enough that another body wouldn't automatically raise questions about patterns. He packed the remains carefully, drove out before the city woke, and left everything near a public Sulabh Shauchalaya toilet block. The location was calculated, a crime in a poor neighborhood, near a place frequented by the kind of people the police rarely looked too closely at. If anyone was blamed, it wouldn't be him. Afterward, he returned to his routine, but he made a habit of passing by the newspaper stalls each morning to check the headlines. Whenever he found a report about remains discovered, his work unnamed, he felt a private satisfaction watching investigators flounder, unable to link any of it back to a single source. Every dead end they hit was, to him, further proof of the distance between their capabilities and his.
The cumulative effect of escaping consequence again and again had done something to the way Chandrakant understood himself. He no longer experienced any anxiety about being caught. In its place was a settled conviction that he was simply smarter than the system, smarter than every officer in Delhi. He had appointed himself a judge, quietly and without ceremony, with the authority to decide who deserved to keep living and who didn't. Back home, he moved through family life without a crack showing. The attentive father, the devoted husband, the neighbor everyone found warm and dependable. No one saw anything. But behind that stillness, his mind never stopped working, reviewing small errors from past cases, refining his approach, waiting with patience for the next person who would give him a reason.
By late 2006, killing quietly and checking the newspapers afterward no longer felt like enough. The rage Chandrakant had carried for years against the Delhi police had been building pressure, and it needed somewhere to go. Anil Mandal, known around the market as Amit, walked into his life at exactly the right moment. Amit was a worker at Azadpur market whom Chandrakant had been watching for some time. Charming, always surrounded by women, with a criminal record trailing behind him. To Chandrakant, Amit embodied everything he despised, a womanizer with no morals, carrying himself like a man of standing while contributing nothing. But this time, the choice wasn't purely personal. He wanted Amit's body to serve a purpose. He needed a vessel for an official declaration of war against the Delhi police. Chandrakant approached Amit the way he always did, with a warm smile and an invitation to share a meal at his rented room. They talked, they ate, and Chandrakant waited for the moment Amit's guard came down. On the night of October 19, 2006, around 8 in the evening, he moved. The ritual was practiced now, binding the hands and feet, reaching for the nunchaku. This, he said, is what happens to men who waste the world with their filth. The chain did its work quickly and quietly. When Amit went still, Chandrakant sat back down, finished the food left in the pot, and took his photograph. Then he stood up and began the next stage, the one he had been planning from the start. He laid 3 long knives on the floor, side by side, each sharpened beforehand and assigned a specific function. The first, long and razor-edged, for severing the head and working along the spine. The second, medium weight, for separating the shoulder joints and removing the arms and legs. The third, thin and precise, for clearing the tissue that clung to the joints after the larger cuts were done. He would later tell investigators, without embarrassment, that he knew how to use a blade the way a butcher at the market did, which cut for which part of an animal, how to work fast and keep the blood from spreading. Years at Azadpur had taught him that. Now he was simply applying the same knowledge to a different subject. The reason for 3 knives wasn't ceremony, it was practicality. A single blade dulls. A dull blade causes the blood to spray rather than flow and leaves ragged edges that make the body harder to pack and carry. 3 blades kept everything controlled, clean, and quiet. It had to be quiet, because on the other side of a thin partition in that same room, his 5 daughters were asleep, his wife beside them. He dismembered a man's body while his children slept a few feet away. He worked through the body methodically, first the head, separated cleanly along the vertebrae, then the shoulders disarticulated and the arms removed, then the legs. The third knife finished what the others left behind. Each piece was wrapped in newspaper, sealed inside thick plastic bags, knotted shut, then wrapped again in jute sacking. He wiped down every surface until the room showed nothing to the naked eye. In the early hours of October 20, 2006,
Chandrakant loaded the remains onto his cycle rickshaw and rode through the dark toward gate number 3 of Tihar prison. He placed the torso, headless, limbless, on the road in front of the entrance with deliberate care, then took out a folded letter and set it on the chest of the body. The letter opened with the same crude insults aimed at the Delhi police that he had used before, and closed with the same initials, CC. But this time it went further. He named names: Deputy Commissioner Manish Agarwal, Senior Officer Balbir Singh. He accused both men directly of fabricating charges against him, of torturing him inside Tihar until something in him broke. He wrote that without what they had done to him, none of this would have happened. Every body was on their hands, not his. After leaving the letter, Chandrakant didn't go home. He walked to a public telephone booth nearby and dialed the Delhi Police Emergency Control Room. When an officer picked up, he calmly gave the location of the body. Then his tone shifted. He reminded them that he had left a body at Tihar's gate back in 2003, and they hadn't caught him then. He asked with open mockery whether they thought they could manage it this time. The call lasted 7 minutes. He spoke like a man with nothing to fear and ended it with a line that would be repeated across every newsroom in Delhi within hours. "Catch me if you're capable. Otherwise expect a gift every 15 days. Then he hung up. The discovery of a headless, limbless torso at Tihar's gate, accompanied by a letter naming senior officers and followed by a 7-minute taunting phone call, detonated across the Delhi police like nothing had before. Every major outlet ran it. The story of an unknown killer bold enough to leave bodies at the entrance of India's most fortified prison, then call the police to gloat, spread fear through the migrant worker communities across the city, particularly among those from Bihar who understood they were the target pool. Command came under intense pressure to resolve the case fast, and for the first time, investigators began pulling together the 2003 Tihar Gate case, the remains found in Mangalpuri, and the other scattered incidents across Delhi, starting to see, in the pattern of it all, the signature of a single killer. While the police scrambled, Chandrakant sat at his vegetable stall and read the morning paper. He found his own case on the front page, described as a mystery killer the police couldn't track down, and read it more than once, making no real effort to hide his satisfaction. What he didn't stop to consider was what that 7-minute phone call had left behind. The booth owner may have seen his face. The call records and any SIM activity tied to that location could be traced. He had been careful for years, but the need to be seen, to be credited, had made him reckless in ways he hadn't noticed. Without knowing it, the clock had started. 6 months after Amit's death, the Delhi police were still going in circles. The silence confirmed everything Chandrakant already believed about them. Then, in April 2007, Upender Singh, 22 years old from Uttar Pradesh, came into his life the same way all the others had. Chandrakant played the familiar role, found him work, offered him a place to sleep. The reason Upender had to die was simple enough by Chandrakant's logic. The young man had been quietly seeing the daughter of one of his close friends. In his eyes, that was a moral failing that had only one appropriate penalty. On the night of April 24, 2007, Chandrakant waited until around 8, the hour when the room went quiet and the alley outside thinned out. He bound Upender's hands and feet, reached for the nunchaku, and announced, "This is the punishment for a man with no morals." Upender struggled briefly before going still. When it was done, Chandrakant set out his 3 knives. But this time he worked differently, slower, more deliberate, because this killing had a different design. He wasn't disposing of one body at one location. He was going to scatter the remains across the city, which meant every joint had to be separated cleanly enough to pack and carry without trouble. He worked through each joint in sequence: shoulders, elbows, hips, knees, cutting at the articulations rather than through bone, a technique he had refined across multiple killings for exactly this reason: less blood, cleaner edges, easier to bag. The torso was wrapped in cloth and placed in a cardboard box, the arms, the legs, the genitals, each wrapped separately. The head was dealt with in a way he was confident the police would never find. He then spent over 2 hours cleaning the room until nothing remained. In the pre-dawn hours of April 25th, Chandrakant loaded his carefully packaged remains onto his cycle rickshaw and moved through a sleeping Delhi with a specific route in mind. His first stop was gate number 3 of Tihar prison, his signature location, the place he had used to announce himself before. He set the boxed torso down in front of the entrance and placed a letter on top of it. From there, he rode south to Tis Hazari Court, the court that had processed his own case, and left the arms there, a direct challenge to the justice system itself. Then he continued to Baba Ramdev Temple in the Hyderpur area, where he left both legs. 4 locations spread across different parts of the city, and he had timed each drop carefully so that all of them would be discovered the same morning, forcing police units across Delhi to respond simultaneously.
The letter he left at Tihar's gate was written in the same handwriting investigators had now seen before, but its tone had shifted into something new. He wasn't just insulting the police, he was writing as a teacher addressing slow students. He told them he had gone to considerable effort dismembering and distributing a body across the city, specifically to give them something to do, because without him arranging their work for them, they would just sit around uselessly. Every line framed him not as a criminal, but as a man operating on an entirely different level, above the police, above the courts, above any law that human beings had managed to construct. He closed with the same promise he had made before, a gift every 15 days for as long as they failed to find him. Then he found a public telephone booth and called the Delhi Police emergency line, reading out each location one by one before his tone shifted into something closer to amusement. He asked whether they were ready to run around the city, collecting what he had prepared for them. Police stations across Delhi descended into chaos that morning as reports of human remains came in from multiple locations simultaneously. Officers initially assumed they were dealing with several separate murders committed on the same night. It took days and DNA confirmation provided by Upender's parents to establish that every piece belonged to the same man. It was the clearest picture investigators had assembled yet. The dismembered bodies scattered across Delhi over the past few years were the work of one person. Phone record data from the public booths he had used was beginning to point in a direction, and Chandrakant, already planning his next move, had no idea that the gift he was preparing would be the last one he would ever deliver. On the night of May 18th, 2007, Chandrakant sat eating dinner in his Hyderpur rented room with Dilip across the table, a 25-year-old from Bihar who had been staying with him for only a few weeks. The offense that sealed Dilip's fate was almost too small to state out loud. He had eaten meat in the room after Chandrakant had explicitly forbidden it, and had kept doing it after being warned. To anyone else, that was a minor domestic irritation.
To Chandrakant, it was an open declaration that his rules meant nothing, a direct challenge to his authority inside his own space. What others would have dismissed as a matter of habit became, in the court he had appointed himself to run, a capital offense. At 8 o'clock that night, he followed the same sequence he always did. He bound Dileep's hands, announced, "This is the punishment for a man who eats meat," and used the nunchaku to finish it. Dileep went still quickly. Chandrakant sat down beside the body and ate as he always did, then laid out the 3 knives. But this killing carried something the others hadn't, a deliberate mutilation. He removed Dileep's genitals and wrapped them separately alongside the other parts. The violence of that night went beyond killing. It was destruction for its own sake. Afterward, he cleaned the room, but faster and with less care than usual. Some blood had seeped into the cracks in the floor without him noticing. In the early hours of May 19, he loaded the remains onto his cycle rickshaw and went out into the dark. This time, he chose gate number 1 instead of gate number 3. No particular reason, just variation, a small adjustment to keep the pattern from becoming too obvious. The torso, wrapped in newspaper, then plastic, then jute sacking, was left at Tihar's entrance alongside a 3-page letter. The arms and genitals were dropped at Tis Hazari Court. Both legs were left at the Kishan Gunj Canal. The head went into the Yamuna River, which he was certain would take care of it permanently. The 3-page letter was the most direct thing he had ever written. It opened with the same crude insults aimed at the police, this time escalating to threats against their mothers and sisters. It closed with the familiar signature in the same promise of a delivery every 15 days. But buried in the middle was a sentence unlike anything he had written before. He stated plainly that he needed to kill at least 7 or 8 people per year, or his mind would break down. It wasn't a threat, and it wasn't a boast. It was a confession, written in the matter-of-fact tone of a man describing a physical need, acknowledging something inside himself that had moved beyond his control. After completing his rounds, he found a public phone booth and called the Delhi Police emergency line the same way he had every time before, giving the locations, mocking the officers, hanging up. What he didn't know was that this time the police weren't simply going to collect the body and stall. They had been working the call records seriously, and the signal data from every taunting call was clustering around the same cell towers, Azadpur and Hyderpur, again and again. The pieces were connecting faster than he realized. The last gift he had just delivered was also the one that would finally give them enough to move.
The investigation broke open through a combination of Dileep's scattered remains and the phone call records that Chandrakant had been leaving behind without fully understanding their weight. Detectives traced the signals back to Azadpur market and began working through the community of migrant workers and vendors until they found a key witness, a co-worker of the victims, who placed Chandrakant as the last person seen with Dileep before he disappeared. The witness described him as someone who played the role of a market boss, issuing orders and positioning himself as a man of influence, but who would quietly vanish on his own late at night and return carrying large plastic bags with an unnaturally calm expression. To the investigators, that profile fit. A man who needed control over others, who selected vulnerable targets, and who had been operating in plain sight for years. While the fieldwork continued, the forensic team ran a fresh analysis of every letter recovered from the Tihar gate scenes. A handwriting expert confirmed what investigators had suspected. All of them came from the same hand. The writing showed someone attempting to mimic an educated style, deliberate and composed on the surface, but saturated with a deep, long-standing rage toward the police, rooted in his past arrest and imprisonment. Taken together with the phone records, the letters had become a trail,
one that pointed consistently toward the same part of the city. Surveillance operations at Azadpur began. Dozens of plainclothes officers, dressed in worn, ordinary clothes, moved into the market, blending in among the porters and vendors, positioning themselves near the stalls and routes Chandrakant frequented. But he wasn't easy to pin down. His instincts for self-preservation were sharp, and he quickly sensed that new faces were watching him in ways that didn't fit the market's normal rhythm. He began rotating where he slept, some nights in the back of a parked truck preparing to leave the city, other nights under an overpass with clear sight lines in every direction. The surveillance teams had to hold back and wait for him to slip. In the end, it wasn't tactics that brought him down, it was exhaustion and the pull of his family. He made the decision to return to the rented house in Alipur, where his wife and 5 daughters were staying, apparently reasoning that his home was the last place police would move on, that they wouldn't force their way into a house with 5 young children inside. He was wrong. That was the moment the waiting teams had been watching for, and they moved the instant he crossed the threshold. On the afternoon of May 20th, 2007, officers surrounded the house and went in. When the guns came up, Chandrakant offered no resistance. He was pressed to the floor and cuffed quickly. He had been sitting on the ground, sharing sweets with his 5 daughters when they entered. The children were still around him. Mamata stood watching, her face frozen, saying nothing. What struck the arresting officers and stayed with them was the expression on his face as they led him out. He was smiling, not nervously, not out of confusion, a wide, settled smile, as though this moment had been anticipated and was somehow satisfying. His eyes carried no remorse at all. By the following morning, news of his arrest had spread through every corner of Azadpur market. When Chandrakant was brought into the interrogation room, he sat with the relaxed composure of a man waiting for a bus. While the officers arranged their paperwork, he finished an entire box of food they had brought him, eating without urgency. When the questioning began and turned to the killings, he spoke about them the way someone might describe a trade they had mastered. Matter of fact, unhurried, occasionally drifting into what looked almost like pride. He said that dismembering a human body was no different from working at a slaughterhouse. You just had to know where to cut. He showed no remorse at any point, and more than once, a faint smile crossed his face, as though he was quietly satisfied that his methods had kept the police running in circles for as long as they had. After the initial statement, officers took him out to walk them through the locations. He led the investigation team to the banks of the Yamuna River and pointed to where he had thrown Dileep's head, and the evidence was exactly where he said it would be. Back in the interrogation room, he walked through his method in full detail. Why he started at 8 in the evening when the building went quiet and his victims were relaxed after dinner. How he bound their hands and feet before announcing the punishment. How the nunchaku collapsed the airway quickly enough to keep the room silent. How he photographed each victim immediately after death to record what he called their submission and his own authority, a souvenir of the work. Then he would sit beside the body and eat, his way of marking the completion of something. After that came the knives. He explained the 3-blade system to officers who had gone very still listening to him. 1 knife for the head and the spine, 1 for the joints of the arms and legs, 1 for the detail work, kept in rotation to minimize blood spread and keep the room manageable. Cleanliness, he told them, was the most important part of the whole process. He would spend more than 2 hours after each killing removing every trace, knowing his wife and daughters were asleep a partition away. The moment that visibly unsettled the room was when he said it plainly. Some of the killings and the dismemberments had happened while his children were sleeping a few steps away, separated from him by nothing but a thin curtain. He had done all of it in complete silence, and none of them had ever known. When asked what drove him to kill, his tone shifted. He said the victims deserved what they got, that they were useless to society, lazy, drunk, dependent on drugs, and above all, ungrateful. He had given them food, shelter, and work, and they had repaid him with lies and disrespect. He framed himself as the real victim of the whole story, a man who had been falsely accused, beaten inside Tihar, and ground down by a system that had treated him like a criminal before he ever became one. The killings were justice, he said. He described himself as a man performing a public service, clearing out human waste that accumulated in places like Azadpur, and stated without hesitation that he saw nothing seriously wrong with any of it. When police searched his rented room thoroughly, they found what they needed under the bed where he slept every night beside his family. All 3 knives sharpened to a working edge, the nunchaku chain. DNA results from the remains left at Tihar's entrance, Tisazari Court, and the Loni Fruit Market matched the victims he had named in his confession without a single discrepancy. He closed his final statement with something close to satisfaction, confirming that he had chosen Tihar's entrance deliberately because he knew it would generate headlines across Delhi and force the police to confront the work of a man they had once arrested for nothing and beaten without cause. He wanted the city to stop trusting its police force. He wanted everyone to understand that he had been able to kill as many times as he chose for as long as he chose, and that the only reason it had ended was because he had decided to let it be seen.
When the trial began in 2012, Chandrakant arrived in court as a different man. Or at least, he tried to appear as one. He retracted everything, claiming the confession had been beaten out of him and that the police had scripted his words under duress. He repositioned himself as a humble street vendor, a devoted father of 5 daughters, a hard-working man who had been selected as a convenient scapegoat for cases the Delhi police had failed to solve for years. His manner in court was calm and measured, almost grandfatherly, convincing enough, perhaps, if the forensic evidence hadn't already been laid out in front of the bench in considerable detail. Because the physical evidence left him nowhere to go, DNA recovered from blood that had seeped into the cement floor and the cracked walls of his Hyderpur rental matched multiple victims. Forensic scientists confirmed that no amount of manual cleaning could fully erase what had soaked into the structure of the room over years. The technology pulled it back regardless of how much time had passed. But what disturbed the investigation team more than any scientific result was what they found on his camera. Photographs of bound victims taken immediately after death, kept deliberately like mementos. A psychologist brought in to assess his behavior noted that collecting such images indicated someone who needed to possess and control his victims even beyond the act of killing itself. Not just ending a life, but owning the moment permanently. The letters completed the case against him. 3 separate handwriting experts from 3 different institutions confirmed independently that the pressure of the pen strokes, the angle of the letters, and the specific idiosyncrasies of the script all matched Chandrakant's handwriting without ambiguity. The letters he had written to taunt the police, the ones he had left beside dismembered bodies at Tihar's gate, had functioned as a signed confession delivered in installments over several years. Defense counsel argued that 2 people's handwriting could resemble each other, but when 3 experts from 3 institutions reached the same conclusion, the argument collapsed entirely. Mamata took the stand and defended him without reservation. She described a good husband, a religious man, a father who loved his children and worked hard to keep them comfortable.
The same man who had forbidden her from working outside the home because he wanted her focused entirely on raising their daughters. She blamed the Delhi police directly, accusing them of fabricating the charges to close cases they had bungled. Her conviction was absolute and genuine, which made it all the more difficult to reconcile with the photographs and blood evidence being presented in the same courtroom. The public began asking openly whether a woman sharing a small rented room with a man who dismembered bodies on the other side of a thin curtain could truly have noticed nothing, or whether love and dependence had simply made the truth too costly to see.
After the verdict came down, Mamata stopped visiting. No letters, no contact of any kind. She found work at a shoe factory in Narela and raised her daughters alone, quietly teaching them to avoid using their family name so the association wouldn't follow them into their lives. The silence from his family became another wall around him. In February 2013, Rohini Court delivered its verdict. The judge found that Chandrakant's conduct met the highest threshold of severity under Indian law: systematic planning, deliberate victim selection, cold execution, and the sustained use of human remains as a tool to challenge state authority. The cases of Anil Mandal and Upinder Singh were sentenced to death. The case of Dalip, which the court described as exceeding ordinary murder in its deliberate degradation of the victim, received life imprisonment. When the death sentence was read aloud, Chandrakant stood and listened with an expression that registered nothing: no fear, no grief, no visible acknowledgement that his own death had just been scheduled. The people in that courtroom found it more unsettling than any outburst would have been. But the story didn't end there. On January 27, 2016, the Delhi High Court took up the case on review and reversed the capital sentences. The death penalties for the Anil Mandal and Upinder Singh cases were commuted to life imprisonment without possibility of remission or early release. The Dalip life sentence was confirmed under the same terms. The court's reasoning was not sympathy, it was procedural. Under Indian law, the death penalty requires evidence that is airtight and free of all reasonable doubt, and the threshold had not been fully met. The families of the victims who had believed the matter closed were left with the knowledge that he was still breathing. For Chandrakant, the outcome meant something particular. He was sent back to Tihar prison, the same gates where he had deposited the remains of his victims, the same entrance he had used as his personal stage to mock the system. This time, he wasn't passing through on the outside, he was going in, and the walls that had once been the backdrop for his theater were now the boundaries of whatever remained of his life.
Inside Tihar, one of India's most tightly controlled prisons, Chandrakant gave the staff almost nothing to work with. He didn't posture, didn't fight, didn't argue with officers. He spent most of his days in the library, reading or sitting in quiet meditation, and his consistency as a model prisoner earned him the trust of the guards over time. He was eventually allowed to take on small duties around the facility because he simply didn't seem dangerous. The stillness he projected was so complete that it was difficult for anyone encountering him for the first time to believe this mild-mannered middle-aged man was the same person who had left bags of human remains at the prison's own entrance to mock the law. While other inmates schemed and caused trouble, Chandrakant waited, with a patience that, to those who knew his history, was the most unsettling thing about him. In 2022, his name resurfaced globally when Netflix India released Indian Predator, The Butcher of Delhi, a documentary series that reconstructed his crimes in detail, from the first victim to the last. The series wasn't just a crime retelling. It became a public indictment of the Delhi police's repeated failures to connect the evidence that had been in front of them for years, failures that allowed additional people to die. Online discussion about the case exploded, with much of the focus landing on how the system had let him operate so openly for so long. The prison administration quietly increased monitoring around him, concerned that other inmates who had watched the documentary might direct their anger toward him. Chandrakant, through whatever filtered information reached him, became aware that he was famous again. In August 2023, after more than 16 years of incarceration, he submitted a petition for temporary release. The grounds were so ordinary they were almost disorienting. His family had no male presence, his eldest daughter had reached marriageable age and needed her father to handle the arrangements, and his wife could not manage such matters alone. The court, noting that over the previous 16 years he had been granted 12 short-term releases and had returned on time without incident on every single occasion, approved a 90-day furlough. The request read like something a concerned father might file from any prison in the country. The reaction was immediate and widespread. The man who had written taunting letters to police while depositing dismembered bodies at Tihar's gate was now being allowed to walk out of that same gate to arrange his daughter's marriage. Relatives of the victims, who had never received a single word of acknowledgement from him, were openly distressed. Officers who had worked the original investigation issued warnings publicly that a killer of Chandrakant's profile, methodical and driven by deep-seated grievance, does not simply recalibrate after 16 years of quiet. The model prisoner behavior, they cautioned, could just as easily be read as a man conserving himself, waiting. The question that circulated through Delhi in the days that followed was one nobody could answer with any certainty. When he walked out onto those streets, which version of Chandrakant would be doing the walking?
The Alipur neighborhood Chandrakant returned to hadn't changed much. Still the same dense streets, the same migrant workers, the same roadside shops he remembered. Mamata and the daughters who had grown up in his absence were still in the same rented room. The family had cut off contact back in 2012 to protect the girls, but the furlough reopened something. The dormant attachment came back to life, and Chandrakant stepped into the role of father again, however briefly. On the surface, it looked like a life resuming. Nobody in that household could say with certainty which direction it was heading. The first 2 months passed without incident. He reported to the local police station every 3 days as required, signed in, and left without anything drawing attention. He helped around the house, sat with neighbors occasionally, walked to the market in the mornings, ate dinner with his family in the evenings. To everyone who saw him, he was simply a quiet, older man with nothing unusual about him. As late October 2023 approached, the end of the 90-day window drew closer. The condition of his release was straightforward. When it ended, he walked back through Tihar's gates and served out the rest of his life sentence. For most people, that's simply what you do. Chandrakant had never been most people, and he had never played by rules someone else set for him. When the date came for him to report back to Tihar in mid-November, the officers waiting to receive him found nothing. No Chandrakant, no phone call to say he was running late, no explanation of any kind. Police rushed to the Alipur rental and found the room cleared out, belongings removed,
Surfaces clean, no trace that anyone had recently lived there. Nobody could say when exactly he had started planning it, but the condition of that room made one thing clear. This was not a decision made overnight. Mamata and the daughters still in Delhi were the first people officers went to. They pressed for anything he might have said before vanishing, any contact he had made, any plan mentioned during the 90 days. Mamata said she didn't know. He hadn't told her anything. Police couldn't determine whether that was the truth or protection, but it didn't matter much either way. The family that had just spent 3 months trying to rebuild something instantly became persons of interest. The life they had painstakingly constructed under the shadow of his name collapsed instantly in a single night. News of his disappearance reached Azadpur market quickly. Vendors and workers who had known him as the market's unofficial elder began exchanging uneasy looks. Newer workers who hadn't been around during those years were told by their colleagues exactly who the missing man was. The atmosphere in the early morning rush shifted. Some workers became noticeably more cautious when strangers approached them with offers of work or accommodation, because everyone now understood that was precisely how Chandrakant had always begun with his victims.
The Delhi police said nothing publicly at first, because there was very little to say that wouldn't compound the embarrassment. They had recently assured the court that he was well behaved and posed no risk, and the man had disappeared within months of that assurance. The 12 prior returns that had built up his credibility were now being discussed internally as the mechanism that had enabled the mistake. Eventually, an official announcement went out. Chandrakant Jha was a wanted fugitive with a reward of 50,000 rupees for information leading to his arrest. The announcement didn't make the situation look any better for the police. It just confirmed, in public and on record, that one of Delhi's most dangerous killers was somewhere out there and nobody knew where. Outside the investigation rooms, the story of Chandrakant's disappearance faded from the news within a few months. Delhi moved on. But inside the offices of the special unit assigned to find him, nothing went quiet. His photos stayed on the board. The families of his victims, who had already watched a death sentence get reduced to life imprisonment, now had to sit and wait while police hunted a killer the system had released on its own authority. Their anger had nowhere to go. The Special Investigative Unit was led by Sanjay Kumar Sen and Ramesh Chandra Lamba, senior Delhi police commanders, with a field team comprising Inspector Mahipal, Sub-Inspector Ankit, Sub-Inspector Gaurav, and Head Constable Naveen. The teams fanned out across Delhi and the surrounding cities, interviewing workers and vendors at wholesale fruit and vegetable markets, extending the search into Haryana, Uttar Pradesh, and his home state of Bihar. They swept every location connected to his past: Azadpur Market, Loni Fruit Market, the Tihar Gate where he had left his bodies. A separate team worked through phone records overnight, combing through enormous volumes of call data, number by number, looking for patterns. The process ran continuously for over 6 months. Chandrakant had been cycling through SIM cards regularly, using each one briefly before discarding it, which made the phone trail far harder to follow than it should have been. While investigators chased leads across multiple states, Chandrakant had gone nowhere dramatic. He had simply returned to the life he had lived when he first arrived in Delhi from Bihar decades earlier, loading and carrying goods at markets, selling vegetables and fruit at wholesale depots in and around the city, rotating between cheap daily rate launchings where no one asked for a name, sleeping some nights alongside groups of workers who didn't know each other. He made himself unremarkable in every possible way. What made it genuinely difficult, beyond just frustrating, was that he wasn't performing this life. He had always been this person.
The men carrying sacks beside him in the market had no way of knowing who they were working next to, and that invisibility was not something he had constructed, it was simply what he was.
He also moved through temples and religious sites, eating the food distributed to worshippers, sitting quietly in prayer among people who asked no questions. A quietly devout older man at a temple draws no attention anywhere in India. The same religious discipline he had once used to police the behavior of the men he brought into his room, no meat, no smoking, strict personal codes, was now functioning as the most effective camouflage he had. The rules he had used to control others had become the thing that kept him free.
Back in Alipur, police returned repeatedly to question Mamata and the daughters, pressing each time for any contact, any arranged meeting, any message passed through a third party. The answer was silence every time. There was no evidence he had reached out to his family even once across 15 months of being missing. The 50,000 rupee reward hanging over the situation meant that even people close to him had to be careful about who was standing next to them. The man who had told the court he needed to come home to arrange his daughter's marriage had not sent his daughter a single word after he ran. Then, in early 2025, the surveillance team analyzing a set of flagged numbers found something unexpected. What finally located him wasn't a technical error on his part, it was an emotional one. He called a friend and asked to speak to his daughter. 15 months of isolation and loneliness won out over discipline. The number he used left a trace in exactly the system the unit was monitoring, and when they ran the location data, the signal was moving toward Old Delhi railway station. Intelligence from a separate source, arriving around the same time, confirmed what the signal suggested. Chandrakant was preparing to leave Delhi for good, heading to Bihar on a train that night. Sanjay Kumar Sen understood immediately that if he got on that train, the window closed, possibly for good. The man who had planned everything with precision his entire life had made his one unguarded move because he missed his daughter. On the night of January 17, 2025, Inspector Mahipal's team and Head Constable Naveen spread out across Old Delhi railway station without drawing any attention, some dressed as vendors, others sitting like passengers waiting for a late train. Every entrance and exit was covered. The station looked the same as it did every night, loud, crowded, indifferent. Then he appeared. Chandrakant walked in carrying a single small bag, moving at the unhurried pace of someone heading home. He went directly to the ticket counter and bought a ticket to Bihar. Nothing about him suggested a man who had been a fugitive for 15 months. The team closed in immediately from multiple directions. He didn't resist. He stood still and let them lock his arms and cuff him without saying a word. What stayed with the officers afterward was the expression that slowly spread across his face. Not fear, not resignation, but something closer to satisfaction. The same smile they had seen when they arrested him the first time, nearly 2 decades earlier. He looked like a man watching the final scene of a story he had written himself and finding it acceptable. The hunt that had run for over 6 months ended quietly at a ticket window, and Chandrakant was returned to Tihar prison that same night, not as the man who had once stood outside its gates and mocked the law, but as a prisoner with no release date and no path out.
The escape itself became the final door closing. The court revoked all future eligibility for furlough or temporary release, in full and for life. The 12 returns that had built his credibility, which the system had used to justify letting him out, now counted for nothing. His last chapter didn't end with execution, as the victims' families had once hoped, and it didn't end with a clean escape, as he had planned. It ended with him confined permanently inside the same walls he had once used as a backdrop for his taunting. the prison whose gate he had treated as his personal delivery point for the dead. Even after being brought back, he gave interviews in the same tone he had always used, dismissive, self-assured, unbothered. He described what he had done as not seriously wrong. He called himself a fighter for the poor, a man who had stepped in to punish the lazy and the dishonest because the law lacked the resolve to do it. He refused, as he always had, to accept the label of serial killer. He was an enforcer of standards that society had failed to maintain. Every word confirmed what the psychology reports had said years earlier, that the thinking which had produced the killings was still entirely intact. The case of Chandrakant Jha became one of the most studied in Indian investigative history, and not only for the crimes themselves. It exposed how consistently the system had failed. Cases dropped for insufficient evidence, missing persons from migrant communities written off as routine, bodies left unconnected because no one thought to look for a pattern across jurisdictions. The fallout led to concrete reforms, stricter DNA collection and storage protocols, stronger coordination between police stations to track individuals who moved frequently between areas, and clearer procedures for treating unidentified remains as potential serial crime rather than isolated incidents. His name became a standing reference point in training materials, a reminder that the friendly older man who helps newcomers find work and offers a free place to sleep may be exactly that, or maybe something else entirely, and that the difference is not always visible until it is too late. If you found this case worth your time, please like, share, and subscribe to The Killer's Record so you don't miss what we cover next. Until then, take care.